Supply chain is one of the most widely talked about topics this year in the cyber insurance market. I'm Yvette Essen for CyberCube, and I'm joined by Charlotte Anderson. She's Senior Cyber Risk Analyst, and she's going to be here talking to us about why it is making the headlines at the moment. Charlotte, thank you for joining me. Could you perhaps first of all explain to me what do we mean by supply chain?
So the supply chain is the network of a company's third parties, like their vendors or contractors and their suppliers. And when we think about supply chain cyber risk, we're thinking about the accumulated risk that a company faces due to the exposure of its supply chain to cyber attacks.
Now, supply chain often is described along with single point of failure. While we're talking about definitions, would you mind defining what single point of failure means as well?
Sure. So single points of failure, or we can also call them SPOFs, are targeted entities for catastrophic cyber attack scenarios that carry a large number of dependent or interconnected entities. And so, because of this, they have this potential for large scale losses and failures across a portfolio in the event of a cyber attack.
Now, this session here is about supply chain cyber risk with tangible, real world examples. Would you mind giving me some of those examples, please?
Sure. So, supply chain cyber attacks are not new in the security world. So we can think about 2013. We saw the Target breach was through an HVAC vendor. The 2017 NotPetya attack was actually through a malicious accounting software update called MEDOC. And there was also the Avast CCleaner supply chain attack, which impacted 2 million global users. But in recent months, we've seen an escalation in both the scale and the frequency of cyber supply chain attacks. These have been perpetrated by both nation states and financially motivated cyber criminal groups and have impacted a large number of private sector and government entities. So a few of these would be the SolarWinds attack, which has impacted around 18,000 organizations via a malicious IT software update. The Microsoft Exchange attack, where over 30,000 entities were infiltrated on their on-premise Microsoft Exchange email servers with follow-on data exfiltration and ransomware attacks. The Excellion file transfer application breach, the CETA breach, which impacted several major airlines passengers, the CodeCov attack, in which hackers injected malicious scripts in a software development tool, and then customers of ClickStudio's Password State enterprise password management product were hit with a malicious supply chain attack that it exfiltrated passwords and sensitive data. So, with all these supply chain attacks, it's good timing that CyberCube is releasing the latest version of the Portfolio Manager product, version 3, next month. And in this product, we model the aggregated loss potential of a collection of catastrophic cyber scenarios in which an attack on one of these single points of failures or SPOFs in the digital ecosystem causes major disruption and loss impacts to a large footprint of companies.
You've just published a report on supply chain and single point of failure. Can you explain briefly what was the purpose of publishing this research?
So I have a couple of aims in my research. So the first aim is just to provide a framework for sorting through the noise of what can often be a confusing cybersecurity media cycle, to help companies and insurers break down these major types of supply chain attacks to understand which recent and historical events fit into these categories so they can then peel back the layers and figure out which companies might be at highest risk for which types of attacks. And then what are the critical controls and remediations that should be looked at to mitigate loss in these areas. And then the second aim with the research is just that it's interesting to look at our portfolio manager catalog to see what we see as the major supply chain threats across our modeled scenarios and to understand what the data shows as the top areas of financial loss that companies face due to supply chain attacks. And I hope that this can help insurers better understand this risk and how it presents in tangible financial loss.
Great, thanks for that summary. The report does identify six top supply chain threats. Would you mind talking me through them? What are they?
Yeah, so the six supply chain threats are data exposure, supplier outage, vulnerable products, business email compromise, access abuse, and product tampering.
Thanks for listing those six top supply chain threats. Would you mind delving into a little bit more detail for each of them, starting with data exposure?
Sure. So, data exposure is the scenario when a supplier who stores or manages a company's sensitive data or financial assets gets breached. So, a recent real world example of this would be the Blackbaud supply chain attack. The second supply chain threat that I discuss in this paper is the supplier outage case, when a supplier experiences extended outages or delays due to a cyber incident. And often we think about this in terms of a cloud service outage. The third type is vulnerable products. So, this is when a supplier produces products with critical vulnerabilities, such as in the recent Microsoft Exchange attack. The fourth type of supply chain threat is business email compromise. So, this is when supplier domains are compromised or mimicked for targeted phishing or business email compromise attacks. And these have a higher success rate due to a higher trust relationship between the company and its supplier. The fifth type of supply chain threat is access abuse. So, this is when attackers infiltrate a supplier network with the deliberate intention of pivoting to target a network, which is sometimes called island hopping, or suppliers are abusing company access to conduct an attack. So, an example of this would be Airbus's suppliers had VPN access, and attackers targeted this access in order to conduct a cyber breach. And finally, product tampering is the last type of supply chain attack. This is when a product is altered to be faulty, to have malicious code, or to cause other types of damage. And a very high profile recent example of this was the SolarWinds supply chain attack.
Now, the report does also touch on single point of failure. What are the key observations and comments that it makes?
So, SPOFs, or single points of failure, are a key part of the CyberCube catastrophic event simulation model in our portfolio manager product. Our modeling philosophy is built upon the CUBE framework, which is a six-sided framework for modeling aggregated cyber events, from attackers, the actors with intent and capability to conduct an attack, to targets, the entities in geographies or industries that are likely to be targeted, to objectives, the ultimate goal and motivations driving an attack, to vulnerabilities, the gaps and weaknesses in the defense posture that can be exploited, to impact, the aggregation potential, duration, and intensity of the attack, and finally to consequences. What are the financial cost components felt by impacted entities that will lead to insurance claims, from legal liabilities to data loss recovery to business interruption costs? These are the six sides of the CUBE framework. And single points of failure, or SPOFs, represent the second side of the cube. These are the targets of the attack. And these are companies that lie in critical parts of the supply chain that have many interconnected or dependent entities. SPOFs provide access at scale to assets or infrastructure that's highly coveted by attackers, such as large-scale financial or sensitive data storage, such as PII, PHI, PCI, or intellectual property, a wide footprint of global enterprise customers that use a single product or service, such as a leading email provider, bank, or point of sale system, or an opportunity for disruption that will set a cascading chain of event to impact many entities, such as a cascading cloud outage or a global flight grounding. The catalog covers SPOFs from all industries that may fall into the six supply chain threats that I describe in the report. I'll give some examples of SPOFs for each of these threat types. So for data exposure, a real-world SPOF was Blackbaud, a software as a service provider that experienced a large-scale data breach last year, exposing data for hundreds of education and nonprofit institutions. A real-world SPOF for supplier outage a couple weeks ago was Swiss Cloud, a cloud service provider that was hit by a ransomware attack causing outages for 6,500 customers. An example of a SPOF for vulnerable products was Microsoft, whose on-premise Exchange email server was discovered to have 4 zero-day vulnerabilities that were exploited at scale by nation-state and financially motivated attackers earlier this year to infiltrate companies, exfiltrate data, and deploy ransomware. A real-world SPOF for business email compromise was Google, as last year during COVID-19, the amount of phishing attacks spoofing Gmail addresses rose dramatically to impact thousands of organizations. An example of a SPOF for access abuse is the Operation Cloud Hopper campaign by Chinese threat actor APT10 to target managed service providers as single points of failure and gain access to their customer base. And finally, an example of a SPOF for product tampering is SolarWinds in last year's attack, in which a malicious software update was pushed to hundreds of private and public sector entities, resulting in infiltrations and data exposure.
And how does portfolio managers' scenarios fall into these supply chain threat categories?
So across Portfolio Manager, we can map each scenario to its corresponding supply chain threat category. And when we do this analysis, we see a few standout supply chain threat types that are causing the largest amount of modeled loss. I won't spoil the surprise, but if you read the report, you can understand what areas of risk these are.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Portfolio Manager version 3, which we have been updating. Does that new version include updates to key scenarios referenced in your report?
Yes, definitely. So Portfolio Manager version 3 does include updates to many of the key scenarios referenced in the report. We have some exciting updates to our footprint and technology vendor dependency database, which provides increased coverage and more detailed mappings of these single points of failure, these SPOFs, to these interconnected entities affected by a cyber attack. We've also made a number of advancements in the way that we model severity or the financial loss based on the cost components that are incurred due to each attack. And finally, we also have a brand new multi-threat actor framework in which we use data from CyberCube's threat actor database to conduct analyses for the probability and likelihood of different threat actor classes to carry out the kill chains for key scenarios.
Charlotte, would you mind highlighting some of the conclusions that the report makes?
Absolutely. So first, the framework presented in this paper can not only be used to better understand and classify CyberCube's portfolio manager scenarios, but it can also be applied to real-world cyber events, both those that have happened in the past and those that are happening today and tomorrow, based on these 6 major types of supply chain cyber risk. Also, for each supply chain cyber attack type, the risk factors and loss potential that I describe in the report can be used by insurers and enterprises to identify key areas of risk and their subsequent loss impacts. And finally, I end the report by highlighting a number of key areas that insurers can focus on when assessing a portfolio for supply chain cyber risk. So my hope is that this can provide some insights to enterprises and insurers while also sparking some healthy discussion and debate as we enjoy having with our internal team, our industry partners, and our clients around the evolving nature of supply chain cyber risk and the most critical areas of exposure, both at the single company level and at the portfolio level.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. A copy of that report, Building Blocks for Catastrophe Scenario, Understanding Supply Chain Cyber Risk and Single Point of Failure, is available to download on CyberCube's website, www.cybercube.com.